All right, guys, what is going on? So if you guys have watched my other videos or have been following my channel, you've seen me do a couple of different float setups, from a fixed float rig to the bead setup to a worm setup. Now I'm going to show you my take on a bobber dogging setup. So my other setups, the fixed float, obviously we use split shot to balance that out. A sliding float rigged up with a bead or a worm, how I showed you, I did that inline setup. So today I'm going to show you my take on a bobber dogging setup, because I've had some people ask for a bobber dog video. So I'm running the center pin today, but any float rod will work, anything, over 9 feet long, with like a 6 to 12 or, 10 to 15 pound rating. Works good for steelhead, just a nice steelhead float rod. Anything you got works. Then this one I'm running, because this is a center pin, and I know you guys have seen me rig up my center pin like 10 times with different rigs. And it's because I change based on the water. And this is a rig that I use when I've got a little bit more flow compared to the other rigs. I showed you a fixed float rig, which is what I fish when the water's low and clear, and I'm really trying to be stealthy. A lot of like summertime fishing, or like, when we have a long periods with no rain, the river gets really low and really clear, I'll go to that fixed system. I showed you the inline float setup, but this is more of a setup where I'm going to fish when there's a little bit more flow, or in these sections of river that have more flow, right? More runs and faster moving water, not those deeper, slower holes and that like walking speed water. This is for a little bit faster water. This is how I set up. So I got my main line. You could run braided line, you could run whatever you want. This is monofilament coming off the center pin. And what I do is I obviously am going to go with a bobber stop. That's a little rubber bobber stop I put on there. That was already on here, so I'm not going to show you how to do that one. But so I slide the bobber stop on, and then I'm going to get my bobber. Now, depending on your style, this is like my take on a bobber dogging rig, and it's not a true bobber dog rig. So if I show you guys a normal float, this is a normal bobber, right? Your normal sliding bobber, kind of a teardrop shape. Here's another one, a foam one, and you can see it's got like a bottom and a top, and it slithers down, and these are meant to sit like this in the water, vertical, straight up and down. And like this one here says 3/8 ounce. So this takes 3/8 ounce to level this float out and get it floating how you want it, right around that black mark on this particular one. So you want that sitting like this. You want it pretty much straight up and down. Now that is kind of your normal float setup, how you want to be fishing. For bobber dogging, they actually make a lot of different style of floats, and kind of floats that they're a little bit odd if you're just used to a regular float. So this is a true bobber dogging style float. This is a little chubby by Arrow Floats, a really good one. I like to use these when I'm bobber dogging. They come in different sizes. I don't know what size this is, probably a small. It's just a little chubby. And you can see they've got this cut off base on these floats, because bobber dogging, basically, to put it in real term, it's basically drift fishing with a indicator, or drift fishing for dummies is what people would say, because you're basically doing the same setup. How I do it is kind of a piece of pencil lead or a piece of weight down there, and you want that weight dragging on the bottom, and you use this bobber to pull that system down the river. So these are cut off face bobbers. So when this is in the water, the current's going down river this way, the nose is pointed down river, and the current is hitting this flat surface, and it helps to drag your presentation on the bottom, right? You got a bobber sitting like this on top, the current's hitting here, your weight is coming down and bouncing the bottom, and that flat surface allows the current to hit that and push it, and that weight to drag along the bottom a little bit smoother. Whereas like this, if you're fishing this kind of float and you're dragging a weight, it doesn't catch the water as good, so your weight might get stuck a little bit more, right? You have to use a little bit less weight. Well, today, how I'm going to set up is, instead of using a true bobber dog float, because this is really designed for fishing specific areas. Your bobber dogging with this style of float and true bobber dogging, is really effective when you're fishing long stretches, right? I can throw that thing out there, the weight can hit the bottom, your bead or whatever can spread out, and that bobber is chucking down river, and this thing can just float down river and stay in a seam line for a long time. It's a very long technique. You throw it out there, it takes a second for the gear to start fishing, everything to settle, and then you can let this thing just run down river as long as you want. So if you're fishing out of a sled or a drift boat floating down the river, it's very, very effective because you can just let this float as you're floating down the river. What I like to do if I'm using this style bank fishing is I'll get to a long stretch of river, you know, 100 or 200 yard stretch of river. Some of these rivers have bank access, you can do that. And if there's not a lot of people around, you have to fish around, I will literally cast and I will walk down river as it's drifting. And I've done a couple videos in the past or older videos where I've showed that. Throw it out there, let that settle, and I literally walk down the riverbank as that float's going and just cover this massive amount of water. And then once I get down to the bottom, I reel in, walk back up, throw it back out, and maybe hit a different seam a little bit further out, a little closer in, and then walk back down that stretch again. And to keep your gear in the strike zone for a long amount of time is really what that is used for. Now, the way that I use this setup, when I'm fishing a lot of bank fishing, some of the smaller rivers, when the water is a little bit lower and clear, you can still do this, you just got to downsize. So this is my downsize presentation. So I'm going to actually use a normal float in this instance, but I'm still kind of bobber dogging. But I'm going to use a normal style float. So this is a Bomac clear float. This is a 1/4 ounce. Now the size is very dependent on, again, the size of river you're fishing and the water you're fishing. Now a float like this, there is no weight on it. It doesn't necessarily take a certain amount of weight because it doesn't need to balance. These floats are designed to take a specific amount of weight because you want them to balance right in the water. This float you want sitting on its side so it doesn't have to balance, and you want that weight dragging on the bottom. So a lot of these you can fish anywhere from like a 1/4 ounce to like a 5/8 or even like a 1 ounce weight. But most of the time, like a 1/2 ounce, about a 1/2 ounce or a 3/8 ounce weight is going to be good for bobber dogging with one of these. But what I'm going to do is, I know the rivers have kind of been lower and clearer, but I want to target the riffly sections, those faster runs, and I kind of want to do a bobber dogging style rig. So I'm going to use my float. I got my bobber stop here. And on these style of floats, I don't even put a bead in between because these style of floats, they don't get stuck on these bobber stops. Most of the time I'm going to run a bead in between my bobber and my float. But this style of float, the Bomac style, I'm not even going to worry about running a bead on top of that float. I literally would just put like that sometimes. Actually today, you know what, I'm feeling like it, I'm going to run a bead on top of it. How about that? Just because I'm feeling like it today, and I'll show you guys what I mean. So I have a little bead. So a bobber stop, a little bead there, and then I'll run my bobber on. Okay, now from here that looks like a normal float setup. Now, normally what I would do, and that's actually, guys, I said a 1/4 ounce float. This is actually a 3/8 ounce float, but I'm going to get to that in a second. So normally, like a 3/8 ounce float, I would take one of these inline 3/8 ounce weights and put it on there because I want this thing fishing vertical in the water like this, and I want my leader going down from there. But this is where my rig is a little bit different. So I got that bobber on there, and now what I'm going to do is, you can use different systems for this. It really depends on your style and what you like to do. But what I've been liking to do is I will take one of these little sliders. This is from Elevated Tackle. It's just a little slider, basically a little piece of plastic around a swivel, and then you've got a little clip on the other end of it. So the slider has a hole in it that I can run my line through. And this one, there's a blue side and a black side. I like to put my blue side towards my float just to be more stealthy. I don't know if it really matters or not, but like that. So it's a little slider with a little snap on it, just like that. And I just slide that on, and you could add beads in there to protect it. I'm not even going to add anything. I'm just going to fish it like that. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a bobber stop. Now this, you could add a bead to this. All I'm doing is protecting my knot. So like I got the slider on there, and normally you could put, say, another like red bead like I had on there, but I don't like putting red beads down there near the bottom because I don't want to spook the fish. So with this setup, I'll grab another bobber stop and I'll just thread it on, and that's gonna protect my knot and kind of cushion it down there. And that, with the bobber stop instead of a bead, number one, I think it's way more stealthy because you don't have a bright green or bright red bead. Sorry, I couldn't get that through. But instead of that bead, you've got just a bobber stop, and it does the same thing. It protects this, so now when this is sliding and bumping and it slides down like that, it's not just jamming up against my knot. Okay, because from here, what I'm gonna do is I'm just gonna tie a swivel on the end. I just take a normal swivel. You guys all probably know what that is. And I tie it on the end here. So now I'm gonna slide this whole thing down and show you from the top to the bottom. So I've got a bobber stop, a little protector bead in there, which on these kind of floats, you don't necessarily have to do that. I've got my little slider here with the snap hanging off of it. And then I've got a bobber stop down there, and that's just to protect my knot. When that thing's sliding and slamming back and forth, you could put one right here as well, but then it kind of defeats the purpose of this being able to slide up your line. But this thing will slide up, and that little bobber stop is just to protect that so it's not jamming up into your knot. So then what I do is I take this little swivel here, and that's where you're gonna add your weight. So I'm gonna grab, this is about a 3/8 ounce float here, but I like to fish about a 1/4 ounce weight under here. So I'm gonna grab some weight, and what you can do, a lot of different ways you can do this. I've got right here these are the P-line weights. You could use the Dave's Tangle free ones. I have a lot of those. You could also just cut, I like to just cut pieces of pencil lead as well. And for this setup, you could be very versatile with the weight because I kind of want to balance this float, but it doesn't have to be perfectly balanced because I'm not fishing it vertical all the time, right? It's not like this float where I'm going to fish it laid over, but I don't necessarily have to fish it perfectly vertical in the water. You just don't want to overweight your weight, because how I do this, okay, I'm going to take that little swivel, so I have a piece of pencil lead cut here. I'm gonna clip that into my little slider here in this little clip. Come on, clip. All right, so now I have that little piece of pencil lead there clipped on my slider. So it looks like that, right? And as I'm drifting down, I adjust this to where this weight is just ticking along the bottom. You know, that traditional bobber dog style where this bobber's laying flat, this weight is pretty much dragging on the bottom, right? It's dragging down there over the rocks. But this kind of more finesse bobber dog technique I use in the lower water and not as big of rivers, bank fishing. I like this weight to just kind of tick. So instead of dragging the whole time, I'll keep it right above the bottom. You know, say I think it's about 4 feet out there. I'll put my bobber stop right at around 4 feet or just shy of it. So this weight is just, right above the bottom. And you want to see this float ticking the bottom every once in a while. So it's not necessarily standing straight up, but it's not laid over like this. It's kind of just every once in a while, just ticking, a bigger rock or the bottom. A lot of times you have the bottom contour changing, right? The river bottom isn't always like this, steady. You have it kind of change. So like in those dips, you want this to be able to drop down. So maybe in those dips, if the bottom's like this, kind of dug out a little bit, this thing will be right down here like this. And then as it comes up, the bottom comes up, then it kind of drags a little bit. Oh, now it dropped back down in the hole. So it's a lot more like, I want to say like half-ass bobber dogging than that full dog. I'm not dragging that thing all the time. It's just kind of ticking along the bottom. So I don't want to watch this float drag like this, although you still can. That's the beauty of it. You don't have to have that style of float. It just kind of helps. I could still put this really deep if I wanted and drag that really hard, but I could also just put it up to where that thing is just barely dragging, and you just see that float barely kind of leaned over and ticking every once in a while, not just dragging the whole time. That's the kind of bobber dogging that I like to do. It's not true bobber dogging, but it's that weight is just down there kind of ticking and dancing right, just kind of playing with fire, if you will. It's not in the fire, in those rocks. It's just kind of just tapping along really lightly and hitting those bigger rocks that are sticking up. So that's kind of my rig. Now off of the swivel, I'm going to run my leader. And for leader length, it kind of just depends. I used to be a very big advocate for running a long leader. And I like the double leader, the long bead setup I showed you guys. It's more of that vertical style, and then you use that split shot to get it down. Whereas this style, this weight here is getting your gear down to the bottom. But the longer leader that you run off of this, the more that bait is going to be rising in the water column. Okay, a longer leader can be good because it gets, this is going to be down there kind of ticking along the bottom. So the longer leader you have, it gets further away from that, so the fish aren't going to see that as quick. But that bead or that yarny or whatever you're fishing, beta eggs, shrimp, whatever it is you got under there, a worm, it has more freedom to rise and get up. So I could go, oh, here's a 4-foot riffle I'm going to toss this rig into. That weight gets down there and ticks the bottom. But if I have a 4-foot long leader, that bead could be up here at the surface while that weight is down here at the bottom. So if you do too long of leader and too shallow of water, that leader is not really down there where those fish are. So I kind of play it by the deeper the hole, the longer the leader I'll run. The shallower the hole, the shorter leader I'll run. Keep it tight to that, right? If it's faster, shallow water, you want that bead to be tight to the bottom, coming through really fast, not, the weight down here and that bead way up here somewhere. It's never even going to get by those fish. So, but the typical I'll run is about a 3 to 4 foot leader. So right here I've got a 12-pound leader. This is just 12-pound fluorocarbon. That is a size, I think either 1 or 2 hook. And I've got a little bead peg in there. That's just a little inline bead that I tied in there. Best way to peg your beads by far. I'm going to show you that in a second. And this one here is about, I don't know, from the tip of my fingers to, I don't know, mid-chest or so. It's probably about 4-ish feet. So I run this leader typically 3 to 4 feet. But in that faster water, when I need it to get down quick, I'll run as short as like a 2-foot leader. So anywhere from 2 to maybe 5 feet is how I run this leader. And I'm going to show you how to put a bead on here really quick. So this is just a Addicted Advantage bead hook. I think that's a size 1 or a size 2. I tied in that little bead there, which I showed in one of my other videos. And on this rig today, I'm going to run a soft bead. You guys have seen me run a lot of the lured beads, the incognito beads. They're my favorite, still one of my favorite beads. But I've really been liking these DRO soft beads. The Core Shot DRO, that one right there has been a money for me. This is a 16 millimeter, but even in the low water, that color has kind of been money for me. So what I'm going to do with this is, you can use a threader or whatever you want, but this doesn't have a hole in it. It's just a solid bead. And I'm just going to take my hook here, and I'm going to run my hook right through the center of this bead. Now it's important when you're threading beads on that don't have a hole that you center these things as best as possible. The more center you do it, the better I think that bead is going to fish out there. Whereas if you push it through all wonky, that bead will sit kind of funky on there. It might not run as right. So I just push it on like that, and I don't push it over the eye of that hook. A lot of people I see will just hook a bead on, slide it up, and they'll slide it right up over that stop. You can do that, and it's very effective to change out bead colors. If you're swapping beads a lot, doing a soft bead with this little peg technique, you can swap beads in and out of here very fast and very efficient. But as you do that, this bead is going to wear that hole inside. It's going to tear bigger and bigger, and then it's going to be very hard for that bead to stay pinned. So what I do is I just have that hook it right through centered like that, and then I'll take the other end of my line here, and I'll make a loop, just pinch a loop in this, like that, and then I hook this loop around the hook, and kind of hook it on the barb, and I take this bead and I slide it over that loop, and now what you did is you just threaded that onto your line, and then you just pull that through, and now that bead is threaded on your line. Wet it down and slide it down to that peg. If you guys need to watch that again, you can go back and watch that a couple times and kind of figure out how I did that. But now that bead is slid down there, and now you have a tiny little hole versus if you just hook it on the hook and slide it over the stop. Once you slide it over that bead, it starts to rip a hole in there, and it really doesn't want to stay pegged. But now it's still solid. These DRO beads are pretty good plastic, so now when the fish grabs it, it doesn't just slide right down over the hook. You can still pop that out of their fish's mouth, right? The reason I like the incognito beads so much is because they have the hard inside on them and they never slide down over the stop. The soft beads, what will happen over time is the fish will grab this thing, and you can see there, it'll slide over that stop down onto the hook, and then it basically fills up that hook, and those fish never will get hooked. And you can see that bead now slid down, right? That's why I don't like running soft beads very much. But for ease of changing out colors and things, you can easily change out colors by pulling them off and on. And they fish a little bit differently than hard beads or the incognito beads. But if I'm going to use a soft bead like this, I'm going to use like a DRO soft bead or a lured soft bead, which are a little bit tougher plastic, some very cool colors, and I thread it on just like I showed you guys right there. So that's my little bead setup, my little bead trick, and I'm going to tie this onto my barrel swivel on this setup here. I'm going to run this I'm going to shorten this up a little bit. It's kind of long here. I'm going to shorten it up more to like probably 3 feet. And tie this onto my barrel swivel here. All right, so I tied that on there. So there's my rig right there, that sliding weight system, my swivel down to my bead. And now I'm just going to go down to the river, and I'm going to adjust this float to where this weight is just down there, just playing footsie with the bottom. And this bead is just going to be right behind that weight down there coming down the river. And the idea is with this is you're keeping that weight tight to the bottom, so you're keeping your bead down tight to the bottom. The other rig I showed you also works very effective, but sometimes it can be harder to keep your bead down on the bottom. Whereas this is going to be very effective at keeping that bead down there with that main weight. And this weight, I can very easily change it on that snap-on there. I can easily change it out. So this is a 3/8 ounce float, so it can hold up to 3/8 ounce. But I can fish anything from like 1/8 ounce or 1/4 ounce up to almost a 1/2 ounce on this float. So I can have a variety of different weights, and I don't get too technical with it when I'm running a piece of lead like this. I'll just take a roll. You can get a big roll of this lead, and you can just kind of start messing around with how big a piece is to cut a piece. I punch a little hole in it so I can clip it on here, and you can start messing around with different sizes. And I might get to a spot where it's like, man, the current's really pushing through here. I can unclip this and I can put on a bigger chunk, right? Here's a bigger piece than what we had on, right? I can put on something like this and that faster, more flowy water, and it takes me 2 seconds to tie that in. To whereas if we had one of these weights, right, you can't really change it out. You tied it into your line, so it's harder to change out. Where this here, I can put a bigger weight on now because I'm in a little faster, heavier water, maybe deeper hole or something. I need to get down quick. So I put that heavier weight on. And then, oh, we walk down river. Now we're at the tail out of the hole. It's slowed down a little bit, and I got to be a little bit more finesse. Boom, take that one off. Clip on my smaller weight, and now I'm fishing really, really well again. Because like I said, with this technique, I'm not just dredging the bottom. I just want it to kind of tick along the bottom. And having too much weight and dragging the bottom too hard can sometimes not be what you want to do. You really want to just barely slow this technique down, right? You got the speed of the current going down the river, and you got your top speed of the river, and the deeper you go into the river, it slows down, right? That's why the fish hang around the bottom. The steelhead hang around the bottom, they hang around the rocks on the bottom because the river is slower. And so what you're trying to do is just slow it down ever so slightly, just to give this bead a chance to slow down just a little bit, to get in their face and hang there a little bit longer. To whereas if I didn't have this weight, any kind of weight ticking on the bottom, and I just threw this out there and it was just flying across the current, this bead would be going a lot faster. I put a little bit bigger weight, I tick the bottom a little bit more, it slows that bead down. If I'm dragging too hard and going too slow, then I feel like it gives the fish way too much time. If you're going too slow, dragging too hard, the fish are going to be able to have, forever, 30 seconds or whatever, to just stare at that bead and go, yeah, that doesn't look right. If it's going too fast by them, they might just go, it's going too fast, I don't want to put the effort in. But if it's going to where it's like, they see it coming, they don't have a lot of time to examine it, to really see that like, oh, look, there's line, there's a hook. But it's going slow enough that they can move over, right? Say they're here comes the bead, they can shift over, boom, grab the bead as it goes by, and float goes down and you get them. So it's very important to adjust that weight. I think it gets overlooked a lot. Even when fishing this style of setup with a normal inline weight, adjusting that weight, adjusting your bobbers, and getting the right flow speed is very, very important, right? When the water is low and clear, you're going to want a more natural speed. You don't want to be dragging as hard. When the water's up, it's moving, you can slow it down a lot more without spooking those fish. So anyway, that is my bobber dogging style setup. I know it's different than some of you guys running these kind and really dogging on those bigger rivers, but this is my little miniature bobber dogging style rig, and it's very, very effective when you dial in that weight and dial it in. So anyway, hope you guys learned something today, and hopefully you guys like this video. My next video should be out on the river. I've kind of been trying to do back and forth, between my videos. I'll show a fishing one, and then I'll be in here talking, kind of go back and forth a little bit. So the next one, I'm going to do a video on me actually being on the river fishing this exact rig. So stay tuned for that, you guys. Hope you're all out there slaying them. Stay warm in this cold weather and catch some steelhead.